The meeting has started and our participants can see us and hear us.
Okay, should just give a moment for people to join. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this HNPW session, Navigating the Dilemma, Armed Escorts, Humanitarian Principles and Operational Realities. My name is Sean Bickley and I'm a Senior Advisor at Global Interagency Security Forum. And I'll be moderating this discussion on armed escorts. For those that are not familiar with GISF, we are a global member-led network of security leads from over 150 NGOs and IOs within the humanitarian development and humanitarian sectors. Armed escorts remain one of the most complex and contested issues within humanitarian security. At the same time, armed escorts have been part of humanitarian operations for decades. Armed escorts, or more broadly, armed protection, sits within a spectrum of security risk management strategies or approaches that organizations can adopt to mitigate risks to their staff and operations, and is intended to serve as a visible deterrent against potential attacks. In the 70s and 80s, when aid organizations were working in Afghanistan, Angola, Eritrea, and Kurdish Iraq, organizations were frequently protected by armed groups. In the 90s, such was the scale of escort use by aid agencies in contexts such as Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Chechnya, that much of the inconsistencies and risks that there were with engaging and using escorts, that many organizations felt that we were no longer in control. And attempts were made to ensure that there was more consistency in the practice across the sector. In 2001, non-binding guidelines on the use of armed escorts were developed by ISAC, the Interagency Standing Committee. These guidelines reinforced the principle that humanitarian convoys should not use armed escorts, and armed escorts should only be used as a last resort, in exceptional circumstances, and only when strict criteria are met. If we look across the humanitarian context today, organizations are increasingly operating in environments marked with rising insecurity and significant access constraints. And the use of armed escorts, be that through operational choice or as a result of requirements imposed by governments or de facto authorities, it is on the increase. A recent study by Brown University in Ocha found that armed escorts were used in 2/3 of humanitarian operations studied, which raises a serious question about how last resort is last resort these days. To explore these challenges and to discuss the implications for principled humanitarian action and security risk management, I'm joined by an experienced panel representing both UN agencies and NGOs. Online with us, we have Wendy McKinchley, Head of Programs at Civic, Bridget Hancock, Senior Field Security Officer at UNHCR, Alan Mordaunt, Head of Global Security at Chokra, Steve Gordon, Senior Director of Global Security at Mercy Corps, and Paul Farrell, Principal Security Coordinator at UNICEF, and Colin Hurian, Head of Diplomatic Engagement and Humanitarian Diplomacy Services at WFP. Okay, just a quick reminder, obviously we have a lot of people online and we want to engage with this conversation. So, as we progress through the discussion, I encourage you to post your questions on the Q&A and we'll come to those questions later on in the discussion. Okay, Wendy, if I could come to you first. Humanitarian principles, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence were developed in a very different area. Considering today's operational realities, how well do these principles hold up when organizations face difficult dilemmas such as the use of armed escorts? And where do you see the greatest gaps are between principle and practice?
Thanks so much, Sean. I really appreciate the topical, the opportunity to really talk about this topical issue. I mean, I think those of us operating in this space have known for a long time that the sort of principles have been absolutely vital to upholding really the moral and sort of operational guides to protecting access, and also for protecting civilians in a quite fundamental way, but that they were also developed at a really different time that predates sort of modern conflict, which has very much changed the context in which many humanitarians are working in, where we've got sort of proxy wars, urban warfare, direct attacks on humanitarians at an unprecedented rate, quite rapidly shrinking civic space, in addition to all of the aspects of sort of asymmetric warfare, kind of private actors, et cetera. I'll just give one example from, there are too many examples to draw from in the news now, but one example in Somalia where Civic has a program is, there were so many different armed actors, especially that were deploying drones, which is one of the most significant increases of risk for humanitarians and civilians in these contexts. I think the statistic is something like a 2,000% increase since 2020 in the use of armed drones. And there, we see new security partners that are equipping and trying to train Somali security forces on the use of drones. And we don't yet have data on how that's affecting humanitarian aid delivery yet there, but it is absolutely affecting access and civilian lives. And there's an example in the Shabelle region that really went awry in the use of drones. And there are, again, too many examples from other conflicts now to list. But I think one of the key things that we need to focus on is a stricter, less sort of strict adherence to the letter of the principles, but really an application of the principles with this sort of operational adaptation, where we really try to prioritize safety, access, and the perception of principled action. There we, where we have peacekeeping missions that are drawing down. This is one of the most stark examples of the challenges that humanitarians face when armed escorts might not be used by humanitarians, but are used by partners, human rights partners, for example, to help make sure that there's a perimeter and help facilitate sort of safe access. I think one of the biggest gaps is in this difference between perception and intent. So even when escorts are technically used for protection, local communities and parties often perceive humanitarian actors as partisan if they move with armed forces, especially when this perception management or sort of stratcoms is really under-resourced, which is often the case. And that means that many of our field-based colleagues face these impossible choices of either refuse an escort and sort of deny aid or accept it and jeopardize their neutrality. And here I think one of the key areas that we've been having to focus on is on sort of policy versus practice, where organizations have principled policies on escorts, but an inconsistent approach to risk tolerance, coupled with this donor pressure for delivery, and bureaucratic incentives which push practice toward compromise, which may not always be sort of well considered. I think I'll just close with a recommendation on the need for reinforcing sort of principled decision making with clear guidance and risk sharing, alignment of donors, which is always a challenge, but is still a necessity, and then investments in negotiation and community engagement, which are always, facilitating or can always be helpful in facilitating and navigating these sort of very difficult dilemmas, as well as transparent and sort of strategic communications in explaining how and why some of these security choices are made. Over.
Thank you, Wendy. That's really insightful. If I can come to Bridget and also to Colin, we talk about the kind of the range of locations that we're using, the scale at which escorts are being used across the sector, and how that is changing. What are your perspectives on the kind of on the data about the operational realities of that? How much where are escorts being used? What are the type of providers? What is the scale of which escorts are being used in your organizations?
I might start from the UNHCR perspective. I mean, in order to understand the scope of what we were talking about, UNHCR conducted 2 surveys, and we did it thank you to our friends in WFP, in the Humanitarian Military Interaction Team. So we had joint metric to kind of measure. And they started doing the mapping first, and we kind of jumped on board, and it showed us a few interesting kind of statistics in terms of at least our current use. I think firstly, armed escorts for UNHCR remain the exception, but have become quite regularized in some contexts, either by SRM, by security, or by imposition, whether it's host government imposition or others parties. Overall, out of 143 of our operations surveyed, 26 country operations were using escorts, and so that represents about 20% of our operations, a little bit less than 20%. The use of escorts for us is certainly concentrated geographically and operationally. So for us, the majority of our escorts are being used in Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, and the Middle East, whereas our other regions are a lot less use of escorts or no use of escorts. Another thing I think to say is the escorts are used for different purposes. So we may have escorts used to accompany personnel moving from part of the country to another part of the country, or parts of the city to communities to deliver programs. It might be accompanying supplies. It might be accompanying movements of forcibly displaced or stateless persons, as is the mandate of UNHCR. So I think, again, the nature of the escort and why they're in place is kind of important for us to also talk about. And then I think another factor to consider is who is the escort provider. So one of the things that we realized from our surveys is we have a broad spectrum of escort providers. We may have national police forces or national military forces. We may have UN peace operations or non-state armed group or de facto authorities in some small occasions. And again, that then changes the nature of the escort and again, to Wendy's point on humanitarian principles. And then I think finally, in terms of the context of use, why are we using them? Our survey found, and our data kind of crunching found, that in 80%, a bit over 80% of the cases, it's actually a requirement of security risk management processes. And of that 80%, 50% of them are also imposed by host nation authorities or host nation communities, right? So we may have an imposition component of why these are also being identified as security management measures. And then I think finally, one of the other things that our data showed us is that there is inconsistent formalization of these arrangements. So whether there's oversight or whether there's memorandums of understanding or procedures in place for governing the use of these escorts was kind of different across the board. I don't know, Colin, if you have anything you want to add from WFP side.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us as part of the panel. I think, there's a lot of complimentary to what you've been saying, Bridget. I think maybe going one step further back, there was this perception that there's an issue with armed escorts, and we went down this road, the data road, to try and understand what is the full scope of the use of escorts. And I think our findings are very much aligned with UNHCR's findings. There's escort usage in every region that WFP operates. There is a concentration in sort of West Africa specifically, but it's not a unique thing in general. So very much aligned with UNHCR's findings on that. I think there's a couple of things to be careful about. I wouldn't say that this is like this data is statistically definitive. It's a couple of surveys over a small window of years, but it's the first step in trying to fully grasp what we're looking at here. I think, and Bridget touched on it, but I think more specifically, there's not a lot of clarity on when an escort might have began being used in a specific context. We don't know if it's been consistent. Like, let's say we start using an escort in one place in 2020 and 2010. We don't know if we've consistently used it until now. I don't know if there's pauses. I don't know if we've restarted, how long there's been a pause, those kind of things. And we don't really have a lot of information on the thought process from 15, 20 years ago, frankly. And I think that's a byproduct of just the amount of the transit nature of humanitarianism. And it's not to say that national staff aren't also moving, changing organizations and those kind of things. So it's just not something where I think there's been really watertight records kept. And I think that's sort of the first problem that we can solve as a community. The other thing too, just building on what Bridget was saying, is sort of the typology of these things. We touched on it before. It's, we're looking at personnel movements. We're looking at personnel and cargo movements with organization-owned fleets. We're looking at commercial truck movements, which I think is an interesting one, and that's not well captured in the data. We know it goes on, but if you're booking commercial cargo movements and a trucking company might be providing the transport, we don't have a lot of data on whether or not they are using escorts or if they're using funds to facilitate their access in a way that we may not be aware of. And I think that that's a variable that we need to have in the back of our minds when we're looking at this, the concept of armed escorts going forward. The other one I think that's important to mention is we're starting to see more and more of these multi-purpose convoys. So these are these sort of government-run convoy on a specific route that includes like a military escort or a security sector escort, maybe it's police, but it could have military resupply in it. It could have, commercial entities involved. It could have mining equipment being moved. It can have humanitarians involved, and it can just have hangers on. So there's one instance where we knew that there was a wedding party that was not formally part of the escort, but about 50 cars trailing behind the escort. So that's an entirely different construct that we hadn't really sort of looked at in a meaningful way. And I think when you're looking at those types of solutions, we have to really ask ourselves, like, what kind of signal are we sending? What kind of risk does this create for communities along the route? Are we increasing visibility in a way that we're putting civilians at risk? Because humanitarian commodities in some instances, or even personnel, are high value in some instances. And I think, we have to ask ourselves, is the humanitarian imperative about accessing those populations warranting the risk that's being brought up by using something like a giant Mad Max style 500 vehicle convoy, which is, scary in its own right. So I think that those types of things are really important in understanding what exactly we're dealing with. And just to reinforce something, I don't think armed escorts are inherently bad. It's a tool. I think, we just need to not be complacent about when and how we use that tool, and we constantly review the rationale for it. So I'll leave it there because I'll ramble on for hours, but thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Colin. I mean, obviously, you're sort of highlighting the diverse nature in which armed escorts are used and the type of escorts and the range of options are out there. I think also it's important, there is a sort of difference in approaches as well across the sector and how organizations look at that. Alan, if I could come to you and maybe just ask, how is there a divergence between the UN organizations and NGOs and the approaches they take toward armed escorts, particularly around policy or decision making, or the constraints they face in using escorts? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I think we can look at it from two angles, as you said, policy, and then the practice, how it's actually used on the ground. And when we look at policy, I think from the conversation here alone, it's safe to say that we're somewhat aligned in that armed escorts are used as a last resort. Yeah, we do not use armed escorts unless access is otherwise impossible. But on paper, that's kind of where it ends, I feel. When it comes to practice, as the other speakers, as Bridget and Colin have been discussing there, UN agencies operate within the security management system, and there's lots of other reasons why they would require that type of an escort. But for a lot of NGOs, particularly those operating through an acceptance-based model, which is the majority, armed escorts are often seen as fundamentally altering the community's perception of the NGO. For many of us, the acceptance isn't just a principle, it's the only or the primary security strategy that we have. So once we move armed actors into that area with us, even if it's mandated by authorities or some other kind of control mechanism, we're starting to shift our alignment, and that can have long-term consequences for access, neutrality, and staff safety, because our national colleagues are the ones that remain there after the escort has left. So we always have to put them to the forefront as to how we're actually operating. There's a lot of capacity issues as well. I feel that there's a big difference. The UN has obviously access to more formalized security arrangements or host government support. Yeah, there's most NGOs don't have this support. And where escorts are imposed on us, and if it's not like imposed by a state body, the funding for professional, accountable, well-trained, like armed escorts is very much impossible for the NGO to be able to afford or get their hands on. I think that's a fair assessment.
Sorry, Alan, you wrapped up there? Sorry, you cut me short there.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Steve, if I could come to you and maybe just dig into this a little bit further in terms of NGO perspectives, but it's seen as a last resort, armed escorts, very much. I think that's a shared commonality between the UN and the NGOs, very much so. But what are the factors that shape Mercy Corps' decision around the use of armed escorts? And do you think that last resort is still the right framing for such decisions?
I think, how can I try and answer this? I'll try and answer this by using examples of where we get these requests for armed escorts. And as an example there, you say last resort. I'll give you a really extreme case. It would be 2013 Syria. We had international team members moving inside Syria. And this was at a time of the rise of ISIS. It was in an area controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra. And they were tailed by a vehicle. So they saw this vehicle was tailing them. It tailed them through, it was like a network of small villages. And the driver didn't recognize them. He panicked. He said, look, I know a Turkmen militia in this next village, drove flat out, got them there. They got to this place. And then this militia came piling out in force, right? And this car shot off. Then they escorted him to the border, right? And now, at the time, we didn't know the number of kidnappings, everything else. Details were coming forward. But it's one of these cases. Was it the right move to associate us with one of these villages? Or acceptance from those communities allowed that they were able to do it? So I would say that's last resort. Okay, that's like a quick thing, decision on the ground. Most of the requests we have for escorts, they come up, they're enforced on us, or donor visits. The most common thing is when donors, diplomatic status, people want to come to the field and their protocol says we need armed escorts. And we're even getting to the stage now that am I allowed to say it here, that the EU insist their guards keep their guns on them when they visit you in certain offices in certain countries now. So these things are getting forced. So it's hard to say it's last resort when these things are coming down the pipeline and your control of them has already pretty much gone from then. Everything's changed fundamentally. I'm old enough to remember crossing into Sierra One into Sarajevo with the UN escort. I did that same journey without the UN escort, and it was a terrifying experience, right? Without, the UN there. And you had this landscape where delivery was seen. You had the neutrality, this envisagement of neutrality, impartiality, the position of UN peacekeepers in different conflicts. These things came through, and these decisions were much simpler ones to kind of make. I think now, I know we're going to dig into this more. If you're talking about this, Alan already touched upon this as well. Colin gave the example in Nigeria with these organised convoys here. They're becoming more and more, and they're proposed to you as an access strategy. If you join this convoy, you'll get to this population who are struggling. There isn't a helicopter going in, but basically you get to join the line of military vehicles, and everything else in between and the local bus, and go forward, and you can access this community. Does that change? A big question. Does that change perceptions of you? I think having worked for several NGOs and used armed guards in different locations, There's so many perceptions of who we are. In Somalia, it was clan-based. For example, knowing who do you have within the clan, capacity, weapons, training, chain of command. We can go on forever about the technicalities that you cannot control there. But again, I mean, the thing is, they will change your perception, these communities. Private contractors will change your perceptions within these communities. There's so many different aspects now that we don't understand. I think in the short term, they can provide a solution. I think long term, we can be looking at much more detailed problems and how we're accepted into our communities as we go forward.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I mean, and I think some of the examples you give bring back my own personal experiences as well of kind of using escorts or being part of escorts and some of the kind of perception issues that we were questioning at the time, you know, when our escorts were still also the same. Escorts were involved in combat operations in the same communities which we were traveling into. So, you know, there's a lot of challenges within that. Just a reminder to everybody online, please post your questions in the Q&A. We'd like to see some of your thoughts and your comments or questions, and we'll come to those shortly. Paul, if I could come to you next. I mean, obviously, when we're looking at the use of armed escorts, you know, most people associate that with a security measure. So in that regard, what are some of the key considerations we need to think about from a security risk management perspective about using armed escorts as a security measure?
Thanks, and thanks everyone for having me on the panel. If I go back to Bridget's intervention, if 84% of the armed escorts use was related to in the UN to security risk management measure, that means this is an important question to ask. Is it a good measure, right? And if I take Colin's point about a tool, I'd like to challenge advisors, decision makers, and even member states who may think of imposing whether this is really an effective tool to do what people think it's going to do. So here are some of the things that we need to consider when it comes to armed escorts as a security measure. The first thing we need to consider is the type of threat that we may be facing. There are three different broad groupings of threats that we can imagine where people could picture armed escorts could be used. One is an armed conflict situation for sure, right? The other is some sort of crime situation where there's armed robbers or carjackings, that type of situation. And the third could be a situation where there is potential looting or civil unrest or attacking vehicles, that kind of thing. And all these three things have totally different potential impacts if we were to take an armed escort. And when we mean armed escort, we mean small arms, firearms, deadly force, right? And that should be an early discussion. Right, what is it that we think we're going to address with this measure? And if we don't have that early discussion, then we're already lost in our decision making. Now, as a solution in general, or as a tool, what is it meant to do? In general, it's meant to do two things. And I would just add to your earlier intervention, Sean, it's definitely meant to deter. But if it doesn't deter, it's meant to repel. It's meant to effectively repel an attack with less loss on our side than that side, right? And these are very complicated things. And to do that well, it's not easy. You just don't put a bunch of people together and drive down the road and go, yes, we're ready to deter and repel. It is not that simple. And I'm not sure that all advisors and decision makers have analyzed the extent to which an armed escort is able to realistically deter and realistically repel. And how do we know it's going to work, right? So what's a common, interesting question to ask is the deterrence of armed actors. And I like to make a bit of a joke that if firearms were the deterrent, there'd be no war because I wouldn't be afraid to fight, right? But obviously it happens because people bring bigger weapons. So the presence of weapons doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to deter or repel anything. So there's a lot of discussion. Now, a lot of analysis is needed, and some of this, we can't even do it properly. So do we really know whether an armed escort is ready to repel an attack? Can we evaluate their weapon systems? Do we know what their immediate action drills are? Do we know what the rules of engagement or use of force decisions are? What is their a chain of command? Do we have a choice on it? Do we prepare for it? These are very, very complicated issues. And how does this apply to an example our colleagues used about escorting supplies? We're not saving lives or saving items. Are we going to use the same deadly force for that? This is very complicated. And I'm not sure people really go into the detailed analysis they need. And if we need to deter, is there another way to do it? Is there another way to create a feeling of, let's leave this target alone, area security, sweeps of roads before? There's lots of other things we could do to try to solve this problem. And then I'll get back to a few more things, I guess, to do the UN point that I think that Steve at least alluded to. We have a common system of decision-making in the one UN approach, where we often think that, okay, everyone has to have the same thing, but are we ready for some nuance? Are we ready for one agency or one program of one agency have a different threat profile who may have better acceptance not to use it? I'm not sure these detailed discussions are really happening. And I guess the final point I'll make and then hand over is, in the UN, I'm sure in NGO colleagues, I'm not really sure we have a robust, structured way of evaluating measures we put in place. Coming back, are we spending this money usefully? Is this really working, or are we just continuing to do it? And the fact that nothing's happened, is that proof it's working? We're not really sure. I think we need to be a lot more analytical about it. So all this to say, I challenge the assumption that armed escorts are useful in many of the places that they say they're going to be useful. And if they are useful, I challenge our ability to evaluate whether we have the right one and the right structure. Back to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and I strongly agree. I think, the question about the principal point is a lot of organizations accept the principle of armed escort use. The challenge really gets into the contextualization and the management of that. Those are where the barriers we come across. And so those are where we have to kind of really dig into and understand when making these decisions clearly. Wendy, if I could come back to you, just reflecting on examples maybe from Ukraine or Mali and Somalia or Sudan. What are the lessons and recommendations that you can draw on how humanitarian organizations navigate these difficult dilemmas around escort use, and what are the risks to civilians and humanitarians as well within those contexts?
Thanks so much, Sean. Really interesting discussion so far, and so many points I want to react to. But let me focus on a few specific points. I mean, essentially, when drawing from lessons and experience of Civic in a handful of these contexts. So we were looking at Ukraine, Somalia, Yemen, and Mali. We looked at one of the kind of big takeaways, including from our research, shows that when organizations combine this sort of contextual negotiation, especially around access, strong community trust, ideally when we've got flexible funding from donors, as I mentioned sort of before, and some approach to kind of institutional risk sharing, we can be in a better position to address these dilemmas about whether or not and how to use sort of armed escorts as a last resort. And here I'd like to focus on maybe three areas. So one is really this people-centered sort of approach to protection in the humanitarian space, which is really prioritizing how we use local networks and partnerships, including local NGOs, without, this is a really important point, without transferring essentially the risk that we face to local partners. And there, working with community leaders on maintaining and negotiating access where international staff cannot, or to facilitate it. We've seen in Ukraine, for example, where volunteer hubs and local NGOs have been really essential to sustaining services in besieged cities. And there, the recommendation is really about scaling localization and making sure that that sort of capacity transfer is happening, including channeling funding. And this is a huge issue now with the humanitarian reset, and has been a long time priority that we've all just been quite bad at, which is really ensuring as direct as possible sort of funding of humanitarian delivery wherever possible with local partners, and then backstopping with technical support rather than leading. And then really trying to empower these local actors with decision making so that they can operate with lower profiles and higher levels of acceptance. And there we do have also research coming out of our Ukraine program, which has been there since 2017, on the importance of the CIMIC role in particular. So really this kind of civil military dialogue role, especially when you've got ongoing high intensity conflict. The second area is around an HD approach. So this is not a new thing, but there's a renewed interest sort of in it now, which is really just investing in negotiation and acceptance strategies. And there it's really using wherever possible skilled negotiators and again, this continuous community dialogue aspect to reduce the reliance on armed escorts. In both Mali and Somalia, we've had really good engagement and some examples of good practice coming out of some of these local level agreements and clan mediation that has opened access when military escorts would have really politicized aid and put the humanitarian staff at greater risk. And then the third area is really around advocating sort of proactively, especially around humanitarian neutrality and protection of medical workers. And here, we've seen such a huge increase in the past year or so on attacks on the delivery of healthcare and attacks on medical facilities, especially from Sudan, Ukraine. We've certainly seen it in Gaza with the humanitarian response there, and we're seeing it elsewhere now. And there, the recommendation is really around strengthening legal and advocacy responses. So you pair these sort of operational choices that we're making on the ground with coordinated advocacy, whether that happens in country or sometimes because of the political sensitivity that has to happen with international actors who don't have this risk or have a lower risk of sort of access and consent. So really working in sort of coalitions has been really helpful there. And there, the advocacy is also around clarifying medical neutrality, on publicizing abuses and in order to try and reduce impunity, and really working on trying to advance this political support for protecting humanitarian space. And there's been a lot of progress. I mean, the trouble is in the implementation, but there's been a lot of progress at the kind of political level around Security Council Resolution 2730 and this Declaration on Protection of Humanitarian Workers, one of the key areas of which is really around facilitating safe access. And just very quickly, the last point is around monitoring and accountability and verification. And there, having a robust mechanism for community feedback and independent monitoring to really expose diversion when it does happen and inform safe programming adjustments is key. And a recommendation there is around investing in community accountability and protection wherever possible. And these, providing for community-led protection mechanisms, survivor-centered approaches, and some mechanism for sort of complaint and feedback systems to be able to maintain trust and identify early risks. And there again, working, those who are able to and have space to work directly with military at the kind of from the policy doctrine level all the way down to some of the operational levels, including on CivMil dialogues, has been really effective at helping to facilitate access. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. Steve and Alan, if I come to you, both of you actually next. I mean, Wendy touched on a lot of kind of those sort of impacts and longer term impacts around escort use in different communities. But from your experience, I mean, obviously escorts may increase access in the short term, but what are some of those second order consequences or impacts towards community acceptance for your organizations, towards access, the perception of your organizations in those communities or by other stakeholders or other armed groups that may be present, and also the security for organizations, especially those organizations who don't choose to use the escorts, who are not able to use the escorts? What is the knock-on consequences for those as well? Steve, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Sean. I mean, there are things as you dig into it, right? And I think kind of Paul started to allude to it when we talk about the quality of the armed actor. And this is to kind of lead down the path towards acceptance, right? But you talk about, you don't know who you're hiring, right? You don't. Now, we work in conflict settings, and usually communities, you'll have a community that's very specific in its dynamics and how the conflict impacts it. Usually, if you're forced to take a provider and say they come from Northeast Kenya, right? You're not going to get a boy from the Northeast in the police uniform. It's going to be someone from a completely different part of the country, right? There can be religious differences. There can be all kinds of little details. You don't pick these things up at first, but gradually they build longer and longer, and you get associated. That political kind of drift can pull you away because of who you're using. You don't know the dynamics. You don't know how they talk when you're not there. I think that distance can be impacted much more. I mean, there's simple things, and it sounds such a stupid example, but armored cars. If one person is an armored car, it's like the concept of nuclear weapons. Everybody then needs one because the risk has just increased for everyone at the same point. So a UN agency says, look, this is our standard now, this is it. Then all of a sudden, that means that there's a level of vulnerability for all those below that skips up as well. I think it's a very kind of similar position as you go down through these. I think when you talk about acceptance, you really need to understand acceptance. You need to understand how these things are. You need to understand that contextualization of the communities you're looking to serve and how they see these things. Otherwise, basically, you're putting yourself on one side of conflict against the other. I mean, it probably lands quite simply along those lines on how they see things. And remember, I mean, I'll let Alan have a word, but if we think about this, think about the conflict in Afghanistan and a lot of perceptions when the West came storming in, it was like, well, this village is wrong because they support the Taliban and this group supports us. There was a whole load of dynamics that happened before, which is why this community didn't feel safe around, you know, some military commander, some police commander. You don't know these things. And then you land and start leveraging that. And essentially then you're using a network that's already alienated you beforehand. I think the long-term consequences are always going to be more problematic.
Thanks. Just, I suppose, following in on that, my kind of headspace was very similar to Steve, and I was thinking in my own head around normalization, which is part of the aspect you mentioned on armored cars. For us, normalization looked like an INGO hiring armed guards in their compound, and then when we took over renting of that compound, we then took over hiring these armed guards. And how do you terminate that agreement without the armed guards potentially being an issue? So there is a real big problem around it being an exceptional case to the standard. And when we look at postures normalizing around weapons and armed actors, we really have to be careful. I think I've spoken previously, and we've all kind of covered the points around perception and the perception of us and how it signals to a local community, and it generally isn't good. But there's also like a collective impact, as Steve was mentioning, that it normalizes it across a corridor or a district, and it almost baselines the risks, or it makes it a baseline measure when risk managers are doing risk assessments. There's also a separate impact then on your staff. So once you start using armed escorts, and this would be like my last kind of point here, but once you start using armed escorts or some form of protection, whether it's an armed escort in this case, or for instance, an armored car, staff become accustomed. There's a psychological threshold that they've now met, and that is their level from here on. So it can be quite hard to remove those assets and normalize things again. Hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, that's very useful indeed. Okay, just to sort of bring this part to the close before we open up to questions. Maybe if I could go back to Bridget and to Colin. So how then, as a humanitarian community, do we manage this use of escorts in a more principled and responsible way as we move forward?
Me first? Okay. Here I come.
I'll call it. You go first.
I got it. She doesn't. Why would you want to follow me? Come on, Bridget. No, I think there's something I wanted to reference earlier that I think is important before we continue on this, which is the intent of the escort. So we've talked a lot about the ramifications of using them. I would argue that a lot of the way that we've discussed this is that our conceptualization that it's a good faith technical arrangement, and that we are doing this with the intention of it providing a certain level of protection to enter an area that we need to get to. I'm not sure that that's always the case anymore. And I think that understanding the intent of de facto authority of a government or whatever to impose escorts on us really needs to be understood, and that we need to be clear that, you know, this could be about the control of our movement. It could be about financial extraction. It can be about containing, you know, access from the larger humanitarian community into certain areas. So I think we need to be realistic about the fact that, like, not all escorts are created equal. And then you layer on everything else that everybody was saying, and how that it impacts our perception about our acceptance strategies, all of those other things. So I think, you know, that's a piece that needs to be considered when we're looking at the rest of this. Now, just in terms of, you know, what we can do about it now. I mean, I think we really have to be clear about the problem that we're trying to solve. Again, I go back to the idea that this is a tool. I don't know, because I don't have the data in front of me, how many places we're implementing a new escort, a new route, a new region. I think a lot of this is holdover from many, many years. And so I don't think there's a lot of new escorts. I'm not saying there aren't any, but in terms of like the 24, 25 context, which Bridget and I have a lot of alignment on from an institutional level, these aren't new places. It might be a new region in a country, but it's not necessarily a new country that's seeing this. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. And then again, it's about the intent. Is it about control? Is it financial? Like, what are we dealing with where our understanding of the situation, whether or not this is being validated through the SRM or some other rationale. I think if we don't really know what we're dealing with, it becomes countering that becomes really problematic. And this goes back to the idea of alternatives. I think we don't do as a community a good enough job of being, you know, interrogating our own exploration of alternatives. And that could be anything from like greater acceptance or, you know, negotiations, as other colleagues have said. I mean, it's even things like airdrops, which are extremely expensive and dangerous in their own right, but is that a better solution in some places than an armed escort? Area security was brought up. I mean, you know, there's things, and in extreme cases, it's even ceasing operations. So I don't know how often we as a community sit down and go through these and go, okay, are we really interrogating this use case dramatically every 6 months, every 3 months? And is there a trigger that we should be looking at where it says, now we need to go look at these? So I think all of that needs to be discussed in a more meaningful way. This is probably not the forum for that, but I mean, I think it gets to the question of like, one, what is our leverage? So we know that there's a problem. We've done the homework. We can point to the homework and say, we don't need this or we do need this. That is the ongoing discussion with the host government, with de facto authorities, with government partners. And then if we get to the point where we can't move the needle because there is a limitation on what humanitarians' leverage will give them, I think that escalates up to this new sort of concept, even though it's not new, of humanitarian diplomacy. Like, how do we take it out of the country context and elevate this in a higher level discussion and see if we can't bring pressure from states to bear on some of these problem sets. Yeah, so I think it demands that we sort of work together. We have to be explicit about the intent. We have to distinguish between like threat-driven use from imposed use. We need to take last resort seriously, and that's not last resort that was determined 10 years ago. It's last resort determined in a period of time that we all agree to, as maybe it's 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever. And we test alternatives rigorously, and we recognize the limits of our leverage. And from there, we start working together. You know, once one of us starts using escorts, especially those of us with a large supply chain footprint, it does have an impact on everybody else, and we are cognizant of that. But getting out of those kind of arrangements is going to take a community-wide effort. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to Bridget. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak again.
I'll be very brief because I can see there's some great questions in the Q&A that we want to get to. I think on Colin's point on imposition, I think this is beyond security to find a solution for an imposition issue. So again, I would say, how can we collectively work together, whether it's at the country level or the regional level, or maybe it needs to go outside of our own organizations. We have a panel discussion next Wednesday, actually, on how security, civ, mil, and access work together to find solutions. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about here. It's not a security issue if we're talking about a host government imposition. Maybe we need to discuss what the role of the RC or the HC is in a case of imposition, or does the country operation actually need support from outside of the country itself at that point, because it's so political. And I think there we've already had some preliminary conversations with donors and with member states, and they're willing to have engagements on this from a state to state conversation, but we need to provide them with what we're actually asking. And so that goes to the HT piece, which Colin talked about. And then I think if it's a security risk management problem, Paul has said everything. How are we actually looking at the effectiveness of a security measure? There's a question in the chat in terms of the expense of escorts, and certainly in this fiscal climate, we need to be looking at cost-effective security risk management as well, and realistically implementable security measures. And then I think that also means in the process of making decisions, alternatives and feasible alternatives are put on the table to decision makers. If decision makers who are managing risk are only given one option, then of course that they're going to take that option to manage the risk to the staff and the colleagues. So I think I'll stop there and we can see what other colleagues have to say in the chat.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you everybody in the panel. Some great thoughts as we go into this Q&A. We've got a lot of response from online, which is great. I mean, a lot of people have been raising a lot of questions, a lot of points. Hopefully we can address some of those now. So as I go through, I'll open up for the panel to come in, whoever feels that they can best talk to those points and the question, and do put yourself forward for that. Just as Bridget just mentioned, one of the questions touches on really around the financial cost around escort use. The question is around, particularly focuses on Somalia, where obviously escorts are used and there's a cost related to that. And so, if escorts are required, as a requirement of our security risk management, the question is, how does the financial crisis that we're facing going to affect our ability to implement or enable programming, given the constraints that might place on escorts and escort use? Does anyone want to talk about sort of the financial impact?
I can start the conversation. I mean, from our data's perspective, I can tell you that one of the arrangements that UNHCR and other UN agencies do make is either logistical support or maybe financial support for the use of the escort. And that has, in this climate, especially with the shrinking donor envelopes and everything else, a cost to the bottom line, and therefore every dollar spent on operations is a dollar away from program and implementation. So I think, again, especially in contexts like Somalia and other countries where the cost of an escort is extremely high, then again, we need to be looking at, is this actually a cost-effective measure? Are there other implementable measures in place? I also think, and this has been discussed in various academic studies, but to what extent do we actually create an economy where there is an incentive to continue a business of at least escorting or privatization of security services to the aid industry? And maybe we also need to reflect on these second and third order consequences, as Alan and Steve talked about earlier, in relation to the economy that we might be creating ourselves.
I'd like to come in on this. Often we hear this notion that, security shouldn't be talking about cost because it's about the lives of the staff and things like that. And I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy, right? Because even if we don't speak about the money that doesn't go to programs. There is a responsibility for security advisors and decision makers to take the limited amount of money and spend it most effectively. And that's the question I raised at the end of my intervention. Do we have a way of knowing whether the money we're spending on certain measures are effective? And I think this also ties into maybe Bridget and Colin's last point about the future, right? One of the issues then for why this may be continuing to go on and why we aren't tackling it properly is an organizational cultural issue around decision makers and whether they're backed culturally for imperfect decisions with imperfect information and things that don't go well. If they're expected on paper to go, yes, we forgive you, it's not perfect, but in practice, any mistake is the career ender, then they're going to be risk averse and they're going to throw money at the issues that they think are going to do their, what I call career risk management, right? And so we really need to be honest on ourselves. Are we really building a culture or organization that allows for prudent and structured risk taking, as opposed to we put it on paper, but really one mistake is a career ender?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, obviously the kind of the additional pressures on organizations in order to maintain meet its duty of care obligations, that creates another level of pressure on senior management to ensure that, well, okay, if everybody else is using Escorts, then we have to use Escorts, and that puts pressure on those organizations and additional cost as well.
Sean,
there was a question.
Can I quickly come in there and just highlight? I think you can use Iraq as an example where you had this sudden boom in private contractors providing these services 2003 onwards. And this kind of answers, it kind of built on from what Paul was talking about, but you don't know what you're getting. So essentially, you will have a guard at the time getting like $300-400 a week, right? They'll have an AK and one magazine. They'll be given a t-shirt. And if you want to save money, you go to the private security, right? That's, if you need an armed escort, you go there. You build this industry. But the thing is they compete with each other. They have to bring down these costs. And the reality is what you have is not protecting you. It's potentially something very, very different as well. So I think we end up in this circle, whatever way you go, looking at it from a cost-effective point. If you try and reduce it, it will get difficult as well.
Yeah, exactly, Steve. Thank you. I mean, it touches to the second question I see there, which is about, a comment about who's providing those escorts. And I think somebody spoke about the kind of growing number of security military, I presume they mean private security or private security companies, etc., offering service to humanitarians. And that proliferation of the PSC space. What are your thoughts in terms of those challenges about having access to those guarding services from private companies, and what does that put additional pressure on organizations to use those services? Does anybody would like to talk about that?
Maybe I can come in here and perhaps Bridget can join me on this one, because when we did the research, one of the things was who was the escort provider, and by and large it's police, it's national police, followed quickly by military, and then even some international military, and then at the very bottom is sort of some non-state armed groups, generically listed non-state armed group, and private military companies. I mean, we use variations of private military companies around the world for different things, protecting compounds and other things. So I mean, I can see that there's a risk of them playing a larger part in these types of arrangements, but I'm not sure that they are, based on what we have in terms of data, they're not the big issue. I think the bigger issue is really like setting up informal economies, unintentionally. Somebody's paying regardless, whether we're paying directly or indirectly, somebody's paying for escorts. And so it's not yet reached a threshold where that's keeping me awake at night. I think there's other issues. That being said, I think when you see some of these commercial relief organizations that are popping up in places like Gaza, there is a real risk that a business model takes shape that offers this type of support in a more real way. We're seeing interesting I think that's a neutral enough word. Interesting stuff happening in Haiti and elsewhere. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. But yeah, I don't know, Bridget, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, certainly our data is consistent with yours on that. So our largest escort provider is most often national police forces, uniformed national police forces, and disproportionately the largest. And then we have a much smaller proportion of national military. When we go to the non-state armed group, and as Colin said, it was quite a broad category. That is a very small percentage, and I think only in one country, and then de facto authority in another country or another two countries right now. So again, the majority are national police forces, uniformed national police forces, and national militaries second in our survey.
There was another question that links to that, which is about, when we're using national police or military as the escorts, and when they're not trusted by the communities, the national authorities are not trusted by the communities. How do we deal with that dilemma then, where our escorts are particularly who we use as an escort is going to create direct problems with the communities that we're trying to serve? Does somebody want to come into that?
I'd like to just say a couple points on that, because on this issue of, let's say, call it imposition by authorities, right? They're assuming that it's not an attempt to track our movements type of idea that somebody may say put on the table as an option. It could be a misunderstanding about responsibility and a question of positions and not interests. Right. So it's about not talking and understanding what the common interest is. And I've seen this multiple times interacting with host government authorities going, oh, they believe that they're going to be in a big political vulnerability situation if something happens, when we could create a way to work together and go, oh, if you adjusted this, you could do that. And that dialogue allows you to understand what are their concerns, what our concerns are, how to find a common way forward. Because you rest assured that government is making decisions on doing things without escorting its own people and different things, right? So it knows when this matters and when it doesn't matter, and it's taking a panacea approach to the UN because it doesn't have time to get into the understanding of how we have common approach. And so that dialogue and interaction is key to understanding a common way forward. To me, that's very, very important, and often we're lazy on that, and we don't get into that discussion about really how can we help each other find a way that both our interests are going to be moved forward.
And then to just add to Paul's points here, I think then that is also the same internally within the organizations, within the Access Working Group, within security management teams and security cells, within civil military coordination bodies. How are we actually not sitting in our pillars, and how are we working together actually to determine if this measure, then this will happen, that's the impact on access, therefore how can we prevent that, who do we need to speak to, etc. And I don't think we're doing that cross fertilization as much as we should be at the country level.
Maybe just to come in here on that particular. Oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead if you want to come. I can come in after.
No, go ahead. I'll follow you.
I'll be pretty quick. I mean, I 100% agree with everybody. I think this is also one of the places where we start to divide ourselves. So it goes back to like, how long have we already been using an escort in that country? I mean, is anybody involved in this kind of call even up to speed on a decision that was taken 10 years ago? And then all of a sudden you find yourselves in there. I also think that this is one of those moments where an operational imperative may drive one or two agencies to take that risk of perception and acceptance and push it through because they feel like the need to meet those real life-saving requirements is there. And then we start to split the system. And I'm not sure that armed escorts are reaching to the HCT in a meaningful way where they're discussing this repeatedly. And then, throw in the fact that you may have a new HC or RC coming in and they may not even be up to speed. So I think that this is a multi sort of faceted problem. And as my colleagues have already said, I'm not sure that we're approaching it in the best way. And I'm not sure I have a perfect solution, but I absolutely think that understanding the rationale and the decision making of the individual agencies is important so that we can explain ourselves a little bit easier. Over.
Maybe I can pick up, Sean, if that's okay, on a couple of the points raised
Please
on
go.
risk mitigation. On risk mitigation and on the funding question. So similar to what others have said, I mean, one of the things is I'm just thinking about how one can use humanitarian sort of dialogue and diplomacy to try to mitigate some of these risks. I mean, one option is sort of escalating to donors and to head office on risk sharing, on sort of alternative funding models, on suspension of operations if the perceived harm outweighs the benefits. And there, so many channels go back to funding decisions. Obviously, having flexible funding to kind of implement safer modalities should be built into really all of these operations, right? So sort of empowering field programs to make decisions that are the most sensible based on the context. I think using also diplomatic channels for clarifying humanitarian independence and really seeking to mitigate, seeking to do risk mitigation with and from the host state. So whether you can ask for civilian escorts or nonpartisan police, for example. I mean, one way to carefully and sort of quietly would be to also document abuses that may have happened in the past as a way to kind of leverage one's position for refusing escorts that may have been implicated in sort of past operations. This goes back to the accountability point that I mentioned earlier. Again, bringing in communities wherever possible and wherever safe to be part of the dialogue as early as possible, explaining, explaining the reasons for security escort choices and sort of seeking their inputs, but again, wherever possible, to kind of bring them in to those to the decision making on security arrangements with host government. We've seen good results in places like Somalia, and then wherever possible, information and kind of safe or non-sensitive intelligence sharing, specifically around civilian harm monitoring, can help agencies assess risks without relying on kind of third-party provided escorts. And here again, just like last point on the funding, is the more that we have access to flexible multi-year funding available for this negotiation, for acceptance building, for kind of lower profile cash modalities wherever possible, and localization, so that agencies aren't forced to take escorts to meet their targets, goes quite a long way. Over.
Thank you, Wendy. There was, sort of jumping across some of the questions, another question here about where situations where larger organizations have escorts imposed on them. So how does that affect other organizations who choose not to use escorts? Or maybe broadening that a little bit more is, our partner organizations who may not have access to those escorts as well. I don't know, Steve, Alan, do you want to come on into that point particularly?
Yeah, I can jump in first, Steve. That's okay. Yeah, there's obviously, like, Trocaro works through partners primarily, so we're always pushing as much knowledge in this area onto our partners as we possibly can. And we've gotten really good in the last 5 years of pushing back on the armed escort or on any sort of like overt protection measures in any of our community kind of access pieces, because it's something we have to be willing to accept the risk that our partners are working in. So why would we come in with special mechanisms in place? Why would we add procedures on? And yeah, it is incredibly unfair when NGOs in general have to try and meet the bar that is set by larger organizations, especially around escorts. Like the cost of an escort in Mogadishu is insane for most organizations, to the extent that we avoid it in every possible way, shape and form. I think we've had one in the past 4 years. Yeah, so like we have to find ways to reduce it all down, to make it manageable. The last piece I got on, it was an armed escort going into Sudan. I responded back to the request asking lots of military style questions to see if it was actually going to deter or repel, as Paul was mentioning earlier. and they cancelled they cancelled the escort in the end. So there's lots of ways we can push back. We just have to do it. Steve.
I mean, coming in there, we are in this model where we're working via partners more and more now. And we're trying not to use the word risk transfer, but the automatic assumption is because they're out there, they have that acceptance, they're part of that community. If the request is coming in from them for an armed escort, I think, and this building on off what Paul's initial points were, what is the actual threat? What are we looking at? I think you have to break this down, and how can you support them in understanding that? Because basically, if a partner is in a position that they actually need lethal force to push through a delivery, you know, I would question how what that circumstances is. I think it's how effective is the process of the armed escort. Why does it exist? Why is the partner in a better position than you are? There's just so many questions. Sorry, I'm probably not making sense, but you know, you would have to delve into this at such a level to understand why, you know, that's required. I think the idea of the partnership model is that the need for these things is lessened because your knowledge of the area increases. You know, so I kind of see that one differently in how we educate and work with our partner organisations.
I'd like to come in on something here about this issue of some people use it, some people don't, and this sort of negative interpretation of escalation, let's call it that, right? I want to put a different, more positive spin on this, right? If we have a situation where everyone's doing armed escorts and people are trying to catch up, then I go to Colin's point. If two agencies actually decide we're going to have a more complex analysis, we're going to do a different approach, we're going to take acceptance, we're not going to use the escort, we could use that as an example to make a downhill snowball where other people can also not use it, you see? Because we often don't have a chance to demonstrate that it could work another way. So this is also a very strong argument to say, either, especially at the level of the UN, let's do a case study approach where we're going to try it differently to show it works, and that can then spiral in a positive way to others to also to see. And so we can also use these opportunities to give evidence of why the thing didn't matter anyway. Back to you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, just going down through some of the questions further. I know we've touched on this a little bit, but maybe it's worth coming back to it again. There was a question about obviously, how do organizations balance the sort of, I suppose, the consequences around the use of escorts when it comes to neutrality and partiality and how we're perceived, and our access. And so how do we kind of balance that where we are recognizing there is that trade-off? How do we address it? What are some of the things we can do to try and offset those negative consequences of an escort use? Does somebody want to come in and talk about some of the measures we can take to offset that?
I can talk about some of the measures we use currently to increase acceptance.
Okay.
That might start the flow. But in a lot of our areas where we are working in very kind of difficult cultural settings, for clan-based issues, there's lots of small things cropping up that turn big quickly. We have a network of community liaison staff that go out and tell people exactly what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. And from an armed escort point of view, if you're going out and telling a community, the community that accepts you, obviously, that you're coming in and the reasons why, and they understand that prior to you showing up, yeah, it definitely creates a little bit of an issue for the armed escort. That's their job. But you are you're throwing something out there first off, and you're trying to stay ahead of the problem that armed escorts can cause. But definitely hand it over to my colleagues.
I can come in here, Sean, for a little bit. I think just to I mean, we're reiterating a few points, but I think firstly to go back to why is the measure an escort? So what is the problem we are trying to solve security wise with the use of an escort? Have we looked at the IAC guidance and had a look at all of the viable alternatives and said, none of those are going to work here, none of those fix that security problem? If that's the case, then we know that the escort is something that we need to use as a last resort or one time or time bound measure, right? And so what is the off ramp? How have we, when we're implementing this measure, how have we designed a reassessment of this measure at a later point? How are we evaluating this at a later point? We don't put this in place forever for lack of creativity. I think the second element is also what is the reason for escorting, i.e. what are we escorting? So going back to our data again, is this supply movements? In which case, does it need to be us? Can it be a third party, etc.? You know, again, we look at the modalities. If we are moving, and I can give the example of UNHCR, if we are moving personnel movement, if it's an escort for a personnel movement, does the escort provider actually inherently carry risk with them too? Right? So is that escort provider mitigating the risk really, or are they actually adding further risks to our plate? For UNHCR, we've had an incident with an escort involving our staff, impacting our staff. So again, what are the consequences of the escort depending on what we are escorting? And then I think the third example from experience is also when we are moving forcibly displaced or stateless persons, how are we working closely with our protection teams in the field with security and protection to actually determine who is best placed to support the movement of persons of concern? Are we asking the escort the actual concern themselves, right, to the people that we are potentially moving? Are they forcibly displaced persons? So again, working together on the ground to determine the best way to implement the measure. It may not be necessarily how it was originally thought by security, but perhaps it could be advanced patrols, perhaps it could be a different escort provider. Maybe it's the police in this instance and not the military, which we would normally use in that context because these are forcibly displaced persons, etc. So again, I think it's context specific, but I think the two things are security risk management. What are we trying to solve there? And the second is what are we actually escorting and what is most appropriate for that?
If I can come in on that, if I riff off of Bridget's comment about how it's set up and back to my comment about getting in dialogue with those providing, there's also ability to start a discussion about the style of it itself, right? Here's what I need from this. Here's what you're going to help me with. And therefore put people here, don't act this way, don't stand here, here's a distance, here's how you, like, there's room for that could really mitigate a lot of this sort of perception of fear of the community, aggression towards the community. And if that doesn't happen, then you know, obviously it's better, if it's not helpful, don't use it. But if it has to happen, that dialogue can also affect the perception by engaging with them on the style of which the results, the mutual interest can be achieved.
There was just also reflecting on the point about in situations where it's mandated, so where the authorities are mandating escort use, and maybe it's not a choice and we don't have necessarily even see the security justification for that requirement. How do we then, as organizations, do we address that and try to ensure that we're mitigating some of the negative consequences of escort use where we're being mandated to? Does anybody want to comment? Wendy?
I think so many good points have been raised that I won't repeat, but really stressing kind of using this community-based protection models, use of community liaison assistance and exploring alternatives. But maybe one or two that haven't been touched on too deeply. One would be you know, the way that we communicate the rationale. I mean, we brought this up a little bit earlier, but really unpacking that. So in a very transparent way, as much as possible, sharing risk assessments with communities and the decision-making rationale. I mean, even if it's imposed, you can, you know, sort of through a dialogue mechanism and through local partners where relevant, you know, just say, you know, here's the process we went to, here are the sort of parameters, here's how we sort of taken community risks into account, here's how we try to mitigate risks with the security partners themselves. And there, I think, really stressing where there has been training or implementation or advocacy on codes of conduct with escorts really can go a long way. And there's a lot of good practice out there where you can at least mitigate the risk where you are required to have them or where there aren't alternatives. So no checkpoints, no searches, obviously advocating for respecting humanitarian space, but really sort of training them on a set of minimum standards around sort of civilian protection and de-escalation in the presence of communities, I think is a really important point. And then, having some kind of community monitoring mechanism, right? A sort of a safe and independent community monitoring mechanism to also help empower communities where we are looking for access to have a role and not feel like they're being sort of stuck with this decision, while also trying to mitigate the risks against both them and humanitarian staff. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to come in on this mandatory requirements and some of the ways we can handle that?
Yeah, I have an anecdote that might be interesting for people. I know that WP, for instance, has refused to go on an escort in a couple of locations when we knew that a certain commander was going to be running it on that specific day, because we understood that there was a trend of more violence when this person was running the escorts. So we were able to track incidents over a period of time, understood that there was a correlation, and then pushed back at a higher level of command to say, we're not going to do it with this guy. So there has been instances where we're doing that, but again, that requires us in context actually tracking what's going on. And I think that it's not to say that we're not doing it everywhere, but I mean, I think that the quality of that tracking is important. And making sure that we are following those things and even understanding what an incident might be on an escort, so that we can start to adjust with the providers as well.
Sean, can I just come in at the end there? There's sometimes when armed escorts are forced on us, it tends to be because there's an international presence. It's a case of there's certain countries where, unless it's absolutely essential, you don't run that. You change your profile, you look at that. In the Sahel, look at options where we've had the staff travel in public transport effectively to maintain that community relationship, but without taking, what was enforced. I think there's ways and means around it when it's kind of forced. But I think, is it absolutely essential? And if you can minimize that presence or do it locally is another way just to try and offset it.
Thanks, Steve. I'm cognizant of time, and we've got a lot of questions, but sadly we can't get to any more, as we need to sort of draw a close to this session. If I could just take time just to ask each of the panelists just to briefly reflect on what are the things, if we were to try and sort of move over the next 12 months, shift the practice around armed escort use, what would be your principal key focus as a community we could do? So Bridget, if I could come to you first.
Thanks, Sean. I think collaborate together to review security risk management measures. I think diplomatic engagement on the imposition issue, I think that's beyond the scope of most likely the country operation. And then I think we're stronger together. So as a humanitarian community, working together to kind of just map the problem and then try and solve the problem.
Thanks, Bridget. Paul, can I come to you next?
I'm going to say two instead of one. Sorry, Sean. So number one is the theme of my intervention. Question its value in the first place. 100%, right? Number two, create a culture in your organization that allows your on the ground and senior decision makers scope to work within imperfection and not expect perfection, and therefore they'll be able to solve problems with different solutions. And if you expect the definition of their success, nothing ever happens, then you're never going to solve the problem.
Wendy, could I come to you next?
I'll be boring and reiterate my main point just because I think it's so essential. I mean, it really is investing, I think, in local partnerships for advancing the sort of acceptance approach, using negotiation, using local partners, using sort of community engagement in a really systematic way, and with this sort of dual benefit approach of also being sort of early, just good practice around community-based protection and sort of being an early warning sort of risk, opportunity, and one which can help empower communities being a part of sort of security decisions in their areas. And I think that's something systematically we can all do a lot better in. And I know it's a big part of the effort in the sort of humanitarian reset to improve on. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. Steve, can I come to you?
I mean, coming back in on that and Paul's point is understanding what is the risk and what will this actually mitigate. If someone comes flying out the bushes for you, right, and it's not criminality, is it going to change anything? What's going to happen? I think you need to look at the reality of why you're asking the question. I realise these things are imposed, but the key thing is, will it make any difference? The other part is for understanding that collaborative and contextual approach to it, working together as a community. It's nuclear weapons again. If one person has them, everybody has to have them. So if we don't all have them, then we're on a level playing field. And that should be the collaborative approach.
Thank you, Steve. Alan, do you want to come in next?
Yeah. I suppose personally, the point Wendy made around partners, local partners, pushing acceptance, they're all the key kind of strategies in most NGOs to push that message out. I suppose from my side, we just need to work on normalizing not having armed escorts as the norm. You know, it needs to be, we need to change the language here on this, and track it over time, because we definitely, Bridget, we spoke about this last year at the HNPW. We'll probably speak about it next year. Be really keen to see where the stats are going in relation to a multi-year look at this, because hopefully it's going down. Thanks.
Colin, lastly with you.
Thanks. I mean, what more is there to say? I think I would try and maybe close the aperture a little bit. I think we know which countries, or contexts I should say, are the most expensive. We know where this is sort of being kind of manipulated in a way. And I think working together on those kind of contexts and trying to find solutions in those complex environments that could become best practices, become lessons learned, that we move to other locations, I think that's critical. I think there are some places where we'll have to be realistic. Is it worth opening this door? So I think there's a judgment call there, and we need to work together to solve those problems. And it goes back to one of my original points, which is the leverage question. Like, does the country offices, the local organizations, do they have the leverage to stop a entrenched system? And if not, then we're going to have to be creative and look at raising the profile of some of these things to a higher level and seeing if we can't get some of the nations involved. I do want to quickly just answer one of the questions in the chat, which was about the guidance. So specifically MCDA and Oslo. I don't think this is a guidance question. I think the guidance is really well thought out. It's non-binding, and I don't think we would have as good guidance if we went back to the membership and said, hey, we want to redo these. I think, unless we want to board a peace stamp, I'm not sure I want to open that door. But I think it's the implementation question. And are we implementing this over time in the most appropriate way? And I think that might be where the weak spot has come to. Over. And thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And as we close, I mean, I would like to thank all of the panelists, I think, for what has been a really insightful debate and discussion around escort use and the challenges that we are posed by that, but also to some degree, as you say, what are some of the potential solutions or alternatives that we need to explore more, or how do we work more collaboratively as organizations to both share the data and understand the data on escort use, but also in terms of the practices and the good practices that we know are, there is very good practices of escort use in certain settings, and how do we ensure that consistently is being used in other settings across the environments where escorts are being used. So I'd like to also thank all the participants online for their engaging questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but they're captured and they will be reflected on as well as we continue to move this discussion forward. It won't be the last time we discuss armed escorts, I'm sure. And yeah, so I'd like to draw us to a close and say thank you.
Thank you very much.
I know.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.